Should beginners learn Linux? Short answer, no. Long answer, maybe. So if you're a beginner, you probably heard that the internet runs on Linux servers, Windows isn't great at development, and then maybe you should just switch over to Linux right away. And those points are only sort of right. Don't get me wrong, I love Linux. I dual boot Windows 10 and Manjaro Linux. But I think as a beginner, you should not download Linux, don't install Linux, just use whatever OS you're already using, probably Windows, and just stick with that. All the development tools and software you want are already going to be on Windows. Everything that a beginner needs is on Windows, and you shouldn't really focus on learning Linux right now. So if you pick up Linux right now, you're going to wrestle around with different things. You know how to navigate around the terminal, how to install different packages. There's a ton of different package managers depending on which OS you pick, what commands you can put in the terminal and what they do. And right now your main focus is you got to be developing. As a beginner, your main goal right now is to open up your IDE, write some functions, learn about classes, variables, things like that, and build cool things. The best way to learn how to program, at least in my opinion, is to take your time, build things that you're proud of and that you really want to use and you find interesting, and build from start to finish. It doesn't matter how long that takes. You'll learn a lot more by building something by yourself than following 5 different tutorials, 10 different tutorials. Building yourself is where you actually become a programmer and not just someone who's copying and pasting from the internet. And if you really need to use these Linux commands, I know off the top of my head that OCaml in particular has some tools that require Linux. And so Microsoft wrote their own software. It's called WSL, or Windows Subsystem for Linux. And basically it just lets you run a Linux environment on Windows, kind of like in the background. And you can use that whenever you run into these situations like these. Obviously, it's not going to be as good as using Linux itself. I found file systems in particular to be a little bit slow, but generally for the purpose of what you need it. Obviously, it's not going to be as good as having Linux install itself. I found personally that it was a little bit slower in the file system. But for your general tasks, it's going to work just fine. Maybe like the video, dislike it, subscribe, leave a comment saying I'm an idiot. Thanks. With all that being said, I think learning Linux is still a really important task as a developer. I just think that you should probably have your bearings with a language and a tech stack beforehand, building basic and intermediate apps at least, before you really make that jump to Linux. Things like being able to navigate around the directories and changing file permissions, things like that are really important to learn. They really speed up your development and they solve a lot of problems you might run into. So I recommend learning Linux for that. Also, as much as I hate to say it, I hate Vi, but you should probably at least learn the basics of it, because otherwise you might run into a situation where you do have to edit files over a remote connection, something like that. And if you don't know Vi, you're probably in for a bad time. It's going to be really frustrating. So I think just knowing at least the basics is pretty important. So at this point, if you're still adamant about wanting to pick up Linux before you start developing, I guess I can give you 3 different recommendations I find that probably are the best for beginners. First is obviously going to be Ubuntu. Ubuntu, I feel, is kind of like the Windows of Linux. It's really popular. It has a lot of beginner-friendly features, things like a marketplace to download the most popular apps and stuff. And on top of that, it has a really large community. A lot of people use Ubuntu, so finding help for different errors you might encounter is going to be pretty easy. And my next one is more of the same. I'm going to recommend Mint. It's kind of built on top of Ubuntu. It's based on Ubuntu, so you get a lot of the advantages of Ubuntu. It also has a really large community, and it kind of has a feel of Windows to it. So I recommend that if you're just jumping over to Linux. And my last recommendation, I'm a bit biased towards, is Manjaro Linux. And that's just because that's the distro I use. It's the first one I jumped over to, and I'm still using it today. Being based around Arch Linux helps with a lot of things. You can use the Arch user repository, which basically makes it a lot easier for you to install different softwares from across the web. Being based around Arch, it uses Pacman to install most of your packages, and there's usually non-instructions for that. So that's where the AUR, or the Arch user repository, is really helpful. It comes in handy. Overall, if you're a beginner, don't just jump straight to Linux. Focus on actually writing the code. But if you're an intermediate and you've been coding for a while, learning Linux can be really helpful, and I really recommend it.